The champagne glass in Karen's hand caught the light like a weapon, and her laughter sliced through the room like shards of broken glass. Mark stood there, frozen, as the cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck, his vintage boxing gloves tucked under one arm, a relic from a time when he felt strong, in control, like he could take on the world. But now, under the weight of her mocking tone, he felt smaller than he ever had in the ring. "Oh, come on, Mark," Karen drawled, tilting her head as she raised the glass higher, her diamond necklace glinting like a cruel joke. "You're not seriously still clinging to that old gym, are you? I mean, how much longer can you pretend it's a business and not a charity case?" Her words landed like body blows, and the crowd around them tittered nervously, unsure whether to laugh or look away. Mark's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady, his pride the only shield he had left. "It's not a charity case, Karen. It's a place where people find purpose. You wouldn't understand that." She smirked, her eyes narrowing as she took a slow sip of champagne. "Purpose? Oh honey, purpose doesn't pay the bills. And let's be honest, neither do you." Her gaze flicked to the gloves under his arm, and she let out a soft, pitying laugh. "Still carrying those around like they mean something? You're not that young man anymore, Mark. Face it, you're just stuck." The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with tension. Mark's hands clenched around the gloves, the leather creaking softly under his grip. He wanted to say something, to fire back, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? That she was wrong? That he was still the man she'd married? The truth was, he wasn't sure anymore. Karen's laughter echoed again, louder this time, as she turned to the group gathered around them. "You should have seen him back in the day," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Big dreams, big talk. But look at him now, still waiting for his big break." She paused, her eyes locking with his, and for a moment, the mask slipped. There was something in her gaze, something sharp, calculated, and utterly cold. Some people just don't know when to quit. Mark felt the room spin, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. He glanced at the gloves in his hands, the worn leather a reminder of a time when he could fight back, when he could win. But now he felt like he was standing in the ring alone, with no one in his corner. The party swirled around him, the chatter and laughter blending into a dull roar. Karen's voice rose above it all, sharp and cutting, as she continued her performance, the diamond necklace catching the light with every movement. Mark turned away, his gloves feeling heavier than ever, and walked out into the cool night air. The silence outside was a relief, but it didn't last long. His mind raced, replaying her words, her laughter, the way she'd looked at him like he was nothing. And then, like a punch to the gut, it hit him. This wasn't just about the gym or the gloves or even the party. This was about something deeper, something uglier. And he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. The party had wound down, the laughter and clinking glasses replaced by the hollow echo of footsteps on the hardwood floor. Mark was stacking empty plates in the kitchen, his hands moving mechanically, his mind still replaying Karen's mocking toast. That's when Alex appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his fingers gripping his phone like it was a lifeline. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "We need to talk." Mark set the plates down too hard, the clatter making Alex flinch. He followed his son into the dimly lit hallway, the air thick with the smell of spilled wine and the faint tang of Karen's perfume. Alex leaned against the wall, his breath uneven, his phone screen glowing in the dark. "I've been seeing things," Alex began, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Mom's been meeting someone, late at night. I thought it was just work stuff, but..." He hesitated, his thumb hovering over his phone. "Here, look." Mark took the phone, the screen lighting up with a string of text messages. Timestamps from 1:47 a.m., 2:23 a.m., 3:11 a.m. Karen's name at the top. Her responses clipped, hurried. "Be there in 10. Don't call me. Keep this quiet." His stomach twisted. He scrolled further, his fingers trembling. A photo of Karen slipping into a sleek black car, the driver's face obscured. A crumpled business card Alex had found in her purse, the edges frayed, the name embossed in gold. Ethan Carter, venture capitalist. Mark didn't need to ask who Ethan was. He remembered the way Karen used to say his name, back in college, her voice softening in a way it never did for him. "She's been taking money from him?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. "For the boutique. Big money. I heard her talking to him on the phone. She said you'd never understand her dreams." Mark's fists clenched, the business card crumpling in his grip. The edges dug into his palm, sharp and unrelenting. He could feel the anger building, a slow burn in his chest, but beneath it was something worse, a cold, sinking dread. How long had this been going on? How many lies had he swallowed, thinking they were just the price of a happy marriage? Alex's hand touched his arm, pulling him back. "Dad, I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." Mark nodded, his jaw tightening. He handed the phone back to Alex, his mind racing. The party, the boutique, the late nights. It all clicked into place with a sickening clarity. Karen hadn't just been climbing the social ladder. She'd been building a life without him, brick by brick, while he stood by, oblivious. "Thanks, son," he said, his voice rough. "You did the right thing." Alex looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of relief and fear. "What are you going to do?" Mark didn't answer. He didn't have one. Not yet. But as he stared at the crumpled business card in his hand, he knew one thing for certain. The man he'd been, the one who trusted, who turned a blind eye, who let Karen call the shots, was gone. And whoever was left would have to be stronger, smarter, ready to fight. The bedroom felt smaller than usual, the air thick with the scent of Karen's perfume and something sharper, like the faint tang of spilled wine. Mark stood just inside the doorway, the business card pinched between his fingers. It was creased now, the edges soft from how often he'd turned it over in his hands. The name on it, Bradley Collins, venture capitalist, was written in bold, smug letters. Mark's jaw tightened as he stared at it, his hands trembling despite the calm in his voice. "Karen," he said, his tone low but steady. "We need to talk about this." She was sitting at her vanity, her back to him, her reflection distorted in the mirror as she removed her earrings. Her movements were deliberate, slow, as if she hadn't heard him. But he knew better. Karen always heard him. She just chose when to respond. "Talk about what?" she finally said, her voice light, almost dismissive. She didn't turn around. Mark stepped closer, holding the card up like evidence in a courtroom. "This, Bradley Collins. Your secret meetings. Alex told me everything." Karen froze for a fraction of a second, her hand hovering over the jewelry dish. Then she sighed, a sound that was more exasperation than guilt. "Mark, seriously? You're going to believe a teenager over me? Alex is a kid. He doesn't know what he's talking about." "He's not a kid," Mark said, his voice cracking slightly. "He's our son. And he's not stupid. Neither am I." Karen finally turned, her face a mask of practiced calm. Her designer heels were kicked off haphazardly by the bed, one lying on its side like a fallen soldier. She crossed her arms, her diamond necklace catching the light and throwing tiny shards of brilliance across the room. "Fine," she said, her tone sharp now. "Bradley is helping me with the boutique. He's an investor. That's it. You're reading into something that isn't there." Mark's grip on the card tightened, the edges digging into his palm. "An investor who meets you at midnight? Who texts you at all hours? Who—" He stopped himself, his chest heaving. "Don't insult me, Karen. I'm not blind." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. She stood, her movements fluid and deliberate, like a predator circling its prey. "You want to talk about insulting?" she said, her voice rising. "How about you never supporting me? How about you always being too busy with your veteran stuff to care about what I want? Bradley sees my potential. He believes in me. When was the last time you did that?" Mark flinched, her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to shout, to throw something, to make her see how much her betrayal hurt. But instead, he just stood there, the weight of her accusations pressing down on him. "This isn't about the boutique," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is about us, about what we promised each other." Karen scoffed, her laughter brittle and cold. "Promises don't pay the bills, Mark. And they don't buy happiness. Maybe if you'd put as much effort into our marriage as you do into your boxing club, we wouldn't be here. Mark's wedding ring felt heavy on his finger, a symbol of something that now felt hollow. He slipped it off, setting it on the dresser with a soft clink. The sound seemed to echo in the room, louder than any words they'd exchanged. Karen's eyes flicked to the ring, then back to him. For a moment, something flickered in her expression. Regret, maybe, or fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same icy resolve. "You don't get to blame this on me," she said, her voice trembling now. "You don't get to act like the victim. This is your fault too." Mark didn't respond. He just turned and walked out of the room, the torn business card still clutched in his hand. Behind him, he heard Karen kick off her other heel, the sound sharp and final. The house felt colder now, the silence heavier. Mark stood in the hallway, staring at the card in his hand. He tore it in half, then in half again, letting the pieces fall to the floor. Somewhere in the distance, a clock ticked, marking the time they'd never get back. The engine idled softly in the empty parking garage, the sound hollow against the concrete walls. Mark sat gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the faint smell of old leather from his gym bag mixing with the stale air. Karen's words bounced around his skull like a ricochet. "You were never enough for me." Each syllable cut deeper than the last. He stared at the empty passenger seat, the imprint of her designer purse still faintly visible on the leather. The gym bag sat slumped at his feet, his boxing gloves peeking out like silent witnesses. He'd bought them years ago, back when he thought he could fight for anything. For her, for their marriage, for the life they'd built. Now they just felt heavy, like anchors dragging him down. He reached for the glove, running his thumb over the worn stitching. The leather smelled like sweat and effort, like something real, not like the polished lies Karen had been feeding him for years. His eyes flicked to the faded photo tucked into the sun visor. It was their wedding day. Karen's smile had been radiant, her hand clutching his like she'd never let go. He remembered how she'd whispered, "Forever," into his ear during their first dance. Now, forever felt like a joke. He yanked the photo down, the edges crinkling in his fist. Her smile mocked him now. Had it always been a mask? Had she been planning this from the start? The garage hummed with the distant echo of car doors slamming. Mark's phone buzzed in the cup holder. A text from Alex. "Dad, you okay?" He didn't answer. How could he? He wasn't okay. He wasn't even close. His mind raced, replaying every dinner party, every fundraiser, every time Karen had paraded him around like a trophy husband. He'd thought it was love. Now he saw it for what it was, a performance. She hadn't wanted a partner. She'd wanted a prop. Someone to make her look good while she climbed her way up the social ladder, rung by rung. The glove slipped from his hand, landing with a dull thud on the floor mat. He leaned back, the seat creaking under his weight. The garage felt suffocating, the air thick with the weight of everything he hadn't seen. Or maybe he had seen it. Maybe he'd just been too damn blind to admit it, too afraid to face the truth. Karen had never loved him. Not really. She'd loved what he could give her. Stability, respectability, a stepping stone to something bigger. His jaw tightened. He thought about the boutique, the way she'd gushed over it like it was her dream come true. Now he wondered whose dream it really was. That financier of hers, what was his name? Hadn't just been funding her business. He'd been funding her escape. Mark's stomach churned. He felt like a fool. A goddamn fool. The glove stared up at him from the floor, its stitching frayed but still holding together. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. Maybe he wasn't as broken as he felt. Maybe, like the glove, he could still hold together. He shoved it back into the bag and reached for the keys. The engine roared to life, the sound sharp and defiant. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to sit here and let Karen's words define him. Not anymore. The rhythmic thud of Mark's gloves against the heavy bag echoed through the gym, each strike a punctuation mark in the story of his unraveling life. Sweat dripped from his brow, soaking the collar of his faded gray t-shirt. The veterans around him, men who'd seen war, loss, and betrayal, nodded in silent understanding. They didn't ask questions. They just let him hit the bag until his shoulders burned and his knuckles felt raw through the worn leather. The gym smelled like old sweat and disinfectant, a familiar, almost comforting stench. But tonight, It wasn't enough to drown out the memory of Karen's voice, sharp and mocking, replaying in his head like a broken record. "You were never enough for me." He swung harder, the bag swaying violently on its chain. The sound of the impact reverberated in his chest, but it didn't silence her words. Nothing ever did. When he finally stopped, his hands trembling, he sat on the bench and stared at his gloves. They were the same ones he'd had since his first deployment, scarred and battered but still holding together. He'd fixed the stitching more times than he could count. Funny how something so broken could still be useful. At home, the silence was worse. The house felt like a tomb, every room a reminder of what he'd lost, or maybe what he'd never really had. Karen's closet was empty now, her designer heels and tailored blouses gone, leaving only faint outlines in the carpet where her shoe racks had been. He stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the emptiness. It was easier than looking at the stack of bank statements on the kitchen table. He'd started going through them the night before, his hands shaking as he flipped through pages of transactions he didn't recognize. Charges for boutique hotels, high-end restaurants, and a jewelry store he'd never set foot in. Then there were the withdrawals, large sums, always in cash, always on days when Karen had claimed she was working late. He'd sat there until the sun came up, the numbers blurring together, his coffee gone cold in its mug. Now he forced himself to sit down and face it again. The kitchen light buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh glare on the papers. He spread them out, methodically marking the suspicious transactions with a red pen. Each mark felt like a punch to the gut, but he kept going. He had to. For Alex. For himself. The sound of gloves hitting the heavy bag still echoed in his mind. A steady, grounding rhythm. He clung to it, letting it drown out the chaos in his head. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, exactly, proof of something, anything. But he knew one thing for certain. Karen had been lying to him for years, and he wasn't going to let her rewrite the story now. He reached for his phone and pulled up the number for a lawyer a buddy had recommended. His finger hovered over the call button for a long moment before he finally pressed it. As the phone rang, he glanced at the empty closet again. The hangers swayed slightly, as if mocking him. He looked away, focusing on the sound of his own breathing. The lawyer answered on the third ring, her voice calm and professional. Mark took a deep breath, his hands still trembling, and began to speak. Mark sat at the kitchen table, the morning light cutting through the blinds like a knife. The overdrawn bank statement lay in front of him, the numbers bleeding red. He traced the line of zeros with his finger, each one a punch to the gut. She'd cleaned them out, every penny. The joint account they'd built together over 20 years, gone. He could still hear her voice, sharp and dismissive, from that last fight. "You don't understand ambition, Mark. You never did." The coffee mug she always used sat on the counter, untouched for days now. He hadn't moved it. The lipstick stain on the rim was faded, but it was there, a faint smear of pink that felt like a taunt. He'd bought her that mug on their 10th anniversary. It had her initials on it, gold script curling around the handle. She'd laughed when he gave it to her, kissed him on the cheek, and called him sentimental. Now it just looked like a prop in a play, something she'd left behind when the curtain fell. He picked up the legal pad, the pages filled with his jagged handwriting. Dates, amounts, transfers he hadn't authorized. He'd spent hours cross-referencing their bank statements with the receipts he'd found in her office. The boutique, of course. The boutique she'd insisted was her dream, her passion project. She'd framed it like it was something noble, something she deserved after years of being stuck in a marriage that was holding her back. But now, staring at the numbers, it felt less like a dream and more like a heist. There were payments to contractors he'd never heard of, invoices for furniture and decor that looked like they belonged in a Beverly Hills showroom, not a small-town boutique. And then there were the transfers, large sums, sent to an account under a name he didn't recognize. He'd Googled it. Some guy from her past, a business partner, she'd called him. Mark had seen the photos on her phone, smiling over cocktails, her hand resting on his arm. She'd said it was strictly professional. He wasn't sure what was worse, the lies or the fact that she thought he was stupid enough to believe them. He flipped to the next page, his hand shaking. The lawyer had said they could fight this, that they could prove financial manipulation. But sitting there, surrounded by the wreckage of their life together, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like digging through the ashes of a house fire, looking for something that wasn't completely burned. The sound of the front door opening snapped him out of it. Alex walked in, his face drawn. He'd been staying with friends since the blow-up, but he'd come back to grab some clothes. Mark watched as his son hesitated in the doorway, his eyes flicking to the legal pad, the bank statement, the untouched mug. "You okay, Dad?" Alex asked, his voice quiet. Mark laughed, a bitter sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just doing some light reading." He gestured to the papers in front of him. "Turns out your mom's got a real talent for creative accounting." Alex didn't laugh. He just stood there, his hands shoved in his pockets, looking like he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Finally, he walked over and sat down across from Mark. "You're not gonna let her get away with this, right?" Mark looked at his son, really looked at him. He'd always thought Alex took after Karen, same sharp features, same quick wit. But now, in the harsh light of the kitchen, he saw something else. A quiet strength, a determination that was all his own. "No," Mark said, his voice steady. "I'm not." Alex nodded, his jaw tightening. "Good, because she doesn't get to do this. Not to you. Not to us." Mark reached across the table, squeezing his son's hand. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. The road ahead was going to be long, and ugly, and painful. But he wasn't alone. And that was something Karen had never counted on. Mark sat at the kitchen table, the signed divorce petition resting in front of him like a loaded gun. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and the faintest trace of Karen's perfume. A scent she hadn't worn in years but had dusted off for the occasion. Her tear-streaked makeup smudged her face, her designer blouse slightly wrinkled from where she'd been wringing her hands. She stood across from him, her voice trembling as she tried to explain, to justify, to manipulate. But Mark's wedding band sat untouched on the table, a silent testament to his resolve. "Mark," she began, her voice breaking, "you're throwing away everything we built. Over what? Money? A few mistakes." Her eyes darted to the stack of bank statements and the crumpled business card he'd laid out like evidence in a courtroom. "You're being ridiculous. You're overreacting." Mark leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of the petition. "Overreacting?" he repeated, his voice low but steady. "You drained our savings, Karen. You lied to me. You were meeting him, don't even try to deny it. Alex told me everything. The texts, the late nights, the money he funneled into your boutique. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed our family." Her facade cracked then, just a little. She reached for the tissue box on the counter, her hands shaking as she dabbed at her eyes. "I was trying to build something for us," she said, her voice rising in desperation. "You never supported me, Mark. You were always so busy with your veterans, your boxing, your life. I needed something for myself. Can't you understand that?" Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. "I supported you, Karen. I supported you when you wanted to open that boutique. I supported you when you said you needed space. But this wasn't about space. This was about you lying, cheating, and stealing from me. From us." She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the tile floor, and for a moment, she looked like the woman he'd married. Confident, beautiful, magnetic. But then she spoke, and the spell shattered. "You're really going to throw this away? After all these years? What about Alex? What about us?" Mark stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He picked up the signed petition and held it out to her. "This isn't about Alex. This isn't even about us anymore. This is about you and the choices you made. I'm done." Her breath hitched, and for the first time he saw real fear in her eyes. "Mark, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'll fix it. I'll make it right. Just give me another chance." He shook his head, his gaze steady. "No, Karen. You had your chances. You burned them all." She crumpled then, sinking into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Her sobs filled the room, but Mark didn't move to comfort her. He couldn't. The man who would have done that, the man who would have forgiven her, who would have believed her lies, was gone. In his place stood someone harder, someone wiser, someone who had finally learned the cost of trust. He walked to the door, his wedding ring still gleaming on the table. He didn't look back. The house felt like a tomb. Mark stood in the living room, his boots scuffing against the hardwood floor that still smelled faintly of Karen's perfume. something floral and expensive, the kind she used to spritz on before heading out to her boutique. The scent lingered like a ghost, refusing to fade. He stared at the empty hanger swaying slightly in the closet, the last relic of her presence. She'd taken everything else. The designer dresses, the shoes that clacked like gunshots, the jewelry that sparkled like shards of ice. All that remained was a single hanger, spinning in slow, mocking circles. He walked to the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The countertops were bare now, stripped of the stupid decorative fruit bowl she used to keep stocked with overpriced organic apples. He remembered how she'd always scold him for eating them. "Those are for display, Mark," she'd say, her voice dripping with condescension. He'd always hated that bowl. On the counter sat his new coffee mug, a chunky ceramic thing with "Veteran Strong" stamped across it in bold letters. He'd bought it last week, a small act of rebellion against the delicate china Karen used to insist on. He filled it with coffee, black and bitter, and leaned against the counter, staring at the empty space where the dining table used to be. She'd taken that too, along with half the furniture, leaving gaping holes in the room like missing teeth. The silence was suffocating. It pressed against his eardrums, heavier than the humid summer air outside. He could still hear her laughter sometimes, sharp and cruel, ringing in his ears like a taunt. But now it was just the quiet. No clinking glasses, no murmured phone calls, no passive-aggressive comments about his job or his clothes or his weight. Just the hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the house settling. He grabbed his boxing gloves from the hook by the door, the leather worn smooth from years of use. They felt solid, grounding, in a way nothing else did these days. The gym had become his sanctuary, a place where he could channel the rage simmering beneath his skin into something productive. He'd started training harder, pushing himself until his muscles screamed and his lungs burned. It was the only way to drown out the noise in his head. The Veterans Boxing Club had become his second home. The guys there didn't care about Karen's boutique or her social climbing or her endless critiques. They cared about showing up, putting in the work, and supporting each other. For the first time in years, Mark felt like he belonged somewhere. He'd even started helping out with the homeless outreach program, spending weekends handing out meals and talking to guys who'd been through worse than he had. It gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. He sat down on the edge of the bed, the mattress sagging under his weight. The room felt too big without Karen's side of the closet crammed full of designer labels. He stared at the empty space, the hanger still swaying faintly, and took a long sip of coffee. The bitterness burned his throat, but it was a good burn, the kind that reminded him he was still alive. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. Not yet. Maybe it never would be. But for the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he was moving forward, even if it was just one punch, one step, one day at a time. He finished his coffee, set the mug down, and reached for his gloves. The gym was waiting. Mark was cleaning out the garage when Alex found him, holding a sealed envelope like it was a live grenade. The faint scent of motor oil and old cardboard hung in the air, mixing with the sharp tang of sweat from Mark's earlier workout. He didn't need to ask who the letter was from. The elegant, looping handwriting on the front screamed Karen, even from a distance. Alex hesitated, his jaw tightening as he extended the envelope. "She came by the house when you weren't there," he said, his voice low and careful. "Tried to give it to me, said it was important." Mark wiped his hands on a rag, the grease smearing into the fabric. He didn't reach for the letter. Instead, he leaned against the workbench, the weight of the past few months pressing down on his shoulders. "What did you tell her?" he asked, his tone flat but edged with something darker. "Told her to leave," Alex said, his voice cracking slightly. "She looked desperate. Kept saying she wanted to talk to you, that she'd made a mistake." Mark snorted, the sound bitter and humorless. "Mistake. That's one way to put it." He glanced at the letter again, the crisp white paper catching the sunlight filtering through the garage window. For a moment, he considered opening it, letting her words pull him back into the chaos he'd fought so hard to escape. But then he remembered the way she'd laughed at him in front of their friends, the way she'd looked at him like he was nothing more than a stepping stone to something better. "You gonna read it?" Alex asked, his brow furrowed as he studied his father. Mark shook his head, his gaze hardening. "No point. Whatever's in there, it's not for me. It's for her." He took the letter from Alex's hand, the paper cool against his calloused fingers, and walked over to the trash can in the corner. Without a second thought, he dropped it in, the envelope landing on top of a pile of old newspapers and empty soda cans. Alex exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and something else. Maybe admiration. "You're not even curious?" "I'm done being curious about her," Mark said, his voice steady but heavy with exhaustion. "She had her chance. She blew it. Now she's just trying to save face." Alex nodded, his hand coming to rest on Mark's shoulder. The weight of it was grounding, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this. "You're better off without her," he said quietly. "You know that, right?" Mark met his son's eyes, the resemblance between them striking in that moment. The same stubborn set of the jaw, the same quiet determination. "Yeah," he said, his voice softening. "I know." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them comfortable now, not oppressive like it had been in those final days with Karen. Mark's gaze drifted to the corner of the garage, where a pair of Karen's designer heels sat abandoned, the red soles scuffed and dusty. He'd forgotten they were there, another relic of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. "You want me to get rid of those?" Alex asked, following his father's gaze. Mark shook his head. "Nah, I'll do it." He crossed the garage, picking up the shoes and holding them for a moment. They were lighter than he expected, fragile in a way that made him think of the woman who used to wear them. But that was the thing about Karen. She'd always seemed untouchable until she wasn't. He tossed the shoes into the trash can, the clatter of heels against metal jarring in the quiet garage. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of finality, like he'd closed a door that had been hanging ajar for far too long. Alex cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You know, if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." Mark smiled faintly, the expression tinged with sadness but also gratitude. "I know, kid, and I appreciate it. More than you know." They left the garage together, the sunlight warming their faces as they stepped outside. The letter and the shoes stayed behind, buried in the trash where they belonged. Mark didn't look back. The heavy bag swung violently as Mark's fists connected, the sharp thud echoing through the gym. Sweat dripped down his temples, stinging his eyes, but he didn't stop. The rhythm of his punches matched the beat of his heart, steady and unrelenting. Around him, the familiar sounds of the Veterans Boxing Club filled the air. The grunts of effort, the slap of gloves against leather, the occasional bark of encouragement. This place had become his sanctuary, a refuge from the chaos Karen had left in her wake. He stepped back, breathing hard, and wiped his face with a towel. The worn leather of his gloves creaked as he flexed his fingers, the same gloves he'd clung to during the darkest nights. They were scarred now, just like him, but still holding together, still fighting. The guys around him were more than just training partners, they were his brothers. Men who'd survived their own battles, who understood the weight of starting over. They didn't ask questions when he showed up with a black eye from sparring too hard or when he stayed late, hitting the bag long after everyone else had gone home. They just handed him a water bottle, clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Keep swinging, brother." Mark leaned against the ropes watching the younger guys spar. Their energy was raw, unfiltered, and it reminded him of Alex, his son. Alex had been his anchor through it all, the one person who'd seen through Karen's facade from the beginning. He'd been the one to hand Mark the evidence that shattered the illusion of their marriage. Even now, thinking about it made Mark's chest tighten. But it wasn't anger anymore, not the kind that burned. It was something colder, quieter. Acceptance. He reached into his gym bag and pulled out the new keychain he'd bought last week. It was simple, just a small metal tag with the word freedom engraved on it. He'd picked it up on a whim, but it felt right. For the first time in years, he wasn't weighed down by Karen's lies, her schemes, her endless need to climb some invisible ladder. He was free, not just from her, but from the person he'd become trying to keep up with her. The guys started gathering for a group photo, calling him over. Mark hesitated for a moment, then jogged to join them. They crowded together, sweaty and grinning, arms slung over each other's shoulders. The flash went off, capturing the moment. Later, when he saw the photo, he'd notice how different he looked. His eyes were clearer, his smile genuine. It wasn't the face of a man who'd been broken. It was the face of someone who'd put himself back together. As the gym emptied out, Mark stayed behind, cleaning up the equipment. He liked the quiet now, the way the space felt when it was just him and the echoes of the day's training. He ran a hand over the heavy bag, feeling the grooves his fists had worn into the leather. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Every punch, every round, every drop of sweat had been a step forward. He thought about the advice he'd give someone in his shoes now. It wasn't complicated. Don't let them make you small, he'd say. Don't let them convince you that you're not enough. And when you figure out what they're really after, don't waste time trying to change their mind. Just walk away. Fight for yourself, not for them. The gym lights flickered as he turned them off, casting long shadows across the floor. Mark slung his bag over his shoulder and headed for the door. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside, and he paused, looking up at the stars. He didn't know what came next, and for once that was okay. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. He was just here, breathing, living, free. As he walked to his car, he felt the weight of the keychain in his pocket. Freedom. It wasn't just a word anymore. It was his life. And for the first time in a long time, it was enough.